I've just finished an extensive analysis of DevOps as practiced in today's companies. As I studied the trends in my research over the past 5 years, I discovered that although DevOps is alive and well, it's also well hidden in the average IT organization. DevOps is indeed a hot trend, but it's more than that. It's an adaptive practice that has helped companies weather the economic and technology-related storms of the past 5 years. My research paper on the topic will be published within the next few days. It's in the final editing process right now. And the material in the paper and in this webinar comes from 3 key sources. One is my research, which has been assessing trends in the way IT organizations collaborate and bridge silos for the past 5 years. The first portion of my presentation will tell you more about these trends in this research. The second source of information is my discussions with vendors. I brief with hundreds of vendors every year and am very well acquainted with their DevOps-related messages. From my perspective, tools play a key role in DevOps, and I'll talk more about that as well. Finally, I have ongoing discussions with IT professionals on a wide variety of topics. This year's DevOps research features some fascinating case studies with 6 companies, and I'll spend a few minutes towards the end of my webinar giving you some highlights from those interviews as well. So what is DevOps? Well, it's another one of those words that everybody defines differently. So as an introduction to the topic, let's first take a look at a definition from kind of a disinterested third party. Now, the underlines in the quote on this slide are my own, since there's some key points in this definition. The first is that it describes a combination of the concepts of dev and ops, and I think that's a pretty common conception of DevOps. It also talks about bridging dev and ops to improve communication. In general, I like this definition because it talks about bridging silos versus breaking them down, which is really a far more realistic way of putting it. The definition also talks about promoting cross-functional communication. However, one key concept it's missing is the concept of collaboration. Collaboration isn't the same as communication. Communication is basically talking about a problem. Collaboration is actually solving it. I believe that the primary reason CIOs are investing in cross-functional teams, tools, and processes is not simply so teams can communicate. It's so they can more successfully collaborate and, in effect, merge their skills and knowledge to produce a greater whole. This certainly includes communication, but it also includes, in addition to skills, processes and tools as well. So why DevOps? Well, there are quite a number of factors that have sort of conspired to make DevOps such a hot topic. Businesses have changed significantly during the past few years. The recession led to increased regulation, which profoundly changed the way companies in certain industries do business. At the same time, revenue shortfalls led to layoffs in many departments, including IT. Often key skills were no longer available, and the specialists who did remain were overwhelmed with the workload. When you combine a lack of personnel with increases in the amount of work, something has to give. Companies were forced to work more efficiently, and this is definitely a sweet spot for collaborative practices such as DevOps. Oddly enough, while the economy was melting down, technology innovation seemed to skyrocket. The growth of some of these innovations, such as virtualization, were driven by a need to maximize resource use. Others, such as sensors, mobile, and cloud, were part of a natural evolution and a convergence of open source, virtualization, and wireless. Innovation impacts IT because it brings additional technologies and devices into the mix. This, in turn, requires new skills and forces changes in the way applications are created, deployed, and supported. You know, obviously, mobile applications are created in different ways than those designed for mainframes or even distributed systems. Adding new technologies to already complex IT environments makes cross-silo collaboration even more critical. Software development radically changed during these years as well. Agile practices helped companies address industry changes more efficiently. Use of open source helped businesses deliver software faster by adding assembly of pre-built components to the developer's toolbox. Languages such as Ruby and PHP became more popular, and new testing methodologies such as A and B testing became part of the application development and testing lexicon. All of the factors I've discussed in the past few slides basically boil down to one key message, and that is the need for speed. Developers have to deliver software faster and with fewer bugs. Operations has to be able to absorb high rates of change with minimal impact to the business. DevOps has emerged as a set of practices intended to make this process more efficient. So it all seems to make sense on the surface, but the research shows that many CIOs aren't convinced that traditional DevOps practices make sense for their organizations. If the benefits of DevOps are so significant, you'd think adoption would be near 100%. However, as you can see, EMA's latest research on the topic finds that only about 30% of companies are even considering implementing DevOps practices. Interestingly enough, if you word the question a bit differently and take the term DevOps out of the equation, the results are also very different. Almost 90% of IT organizations surveyed tell us they already leverage a team-based approach combining both dev and ops skill sets. In the majority of companies, this is actually a dedicated versus an ad hoc team. So these are personnel who spend 100% of their time collaborating across silo skill sets. Again, coming back to the DevOps term, we see that it's used in only about 5% of companies overall. These cross-functional teams more often go by names such as infrastructure services, application management, and that sort of thing. And finally, the last research-based slide interested me as well. The research also shows that these teams are viewed as essential by high-level IT executives. Most are actually funded at the CIO or director level, and this is the case far more often than getting funding through either operations or development budgets. So it's a very much more cross-functional budget that is based at a higher level in the IT organization. Now, why is this research so important? Well, I've been watching it over the years, and it leads me to believe that cross-functional collaboration across the life cycle is far more important to most companies than the simple turnover of responsibility that we typically associate with DevOps. I believe that DevOps is morphing into a different form. It's called by a different name. it's more a life cycle than a point-in-time handover of responsibility, and it's as dependent on automation as it is on personnel and skills. So the traditional idea of DevOps within a 6-stage life cycle looks something like this. Development designs, develops, and tests the software. Then development and operations work together to deploy it to production, which typically is considered to be the DevOps process. After deployment, the responsibility for managing the application and assessing performance via service level agreements falls into the sphere of operations. Throughout the life cycle, operations complains that software was thrown over the wall. Development complains that operations understands infrastructure, but really doesn't know much about how applications really work. So when something goes wrong, everybody points fingers, then grudgingly gathers in a room to sort out the problem. Now, this model has been in place for decades. What's changed with the whole idea of DevOps is that ITIL and other frameworks have brought more of a DevOps and governance focus into the change and release management processes. Now, this graphic shows is much more of a picture of how I have seen DevOps actually evolving over the years. Companies which have invested in the collaborative teams I described earlier are taking a far more life cycle-centric approach. Now, when you consider this approach as opposed to the one on the prior slide, there are actually two major differences. One is that leadership handoffs replace handoffs of responsibility. In other words, nobody's tossing the application over the wall to anybody else. This occurs at virtually every stage of the life cycle, not just at deployment. The other key difference is that there's a very real third participant in the process, and that is line of business. In part, this is an offshoot of Agile development, in which business stakeholders are key participants in the iterative Agile life cycle. It's actually also basic common sense, particularly at specific stages in the life cycle. In this model, business stakeholders lead the assessment process since they're in a far better position to understand how an application is meeting the needs of the business. Operations provides metrics and measurements for tracking service levels, while development is kept in the loop regarding the reasons for positive or negative assessments. During the design phase, business and development are joint leads. This ensures that application designs meet the needs of the business. Development, of course, takes the lead during the development phase, while development and operations collaborate as joint leads during testing and deployment. At this particular stage, development provides the coding knowledge, while operations assists with complex tasks such as integration testing and setting up complex environments. This also gives operations an opportunity to evaluate the new application for any special characteristics or provisioning requirements. Operations is the primary lead for managing the production aspects of running the application and shares ongoing service level assessment responsibilities via metrics and tool sets. So this is the life cycle concept, which seems to be taking hold, particularly as Agile development becomes the norm for application deployment, development and deployment. Since each team has deep skills in a specific area, the role of tools becomes a very important one, and it's primarily centered around the idea of bridging skills gaps. From this perspective, tools enable personnel with diverse skills to view the application holistically and understand how their own silo impacts the application as a whole. The tooling aspects of application support become critical as tools become a key factor supporting a unified lifecycle approach. Now, as part of this research, I approached approximately 30 vendors and offering them the opportunity basically to provide input. I very much appreciate the time these 12 vendors that you can see here took to actually be part of this research. In my written report, each vendor listed here describes exactly how its solutions support selected life cycle stages. And as you can see, not all vendors support all stages, but this is really okay. When you approach DevOps as a life cycle, interoperability becomes a key capability. It facilitates the reality of today's businesses, most of which have multiple tools from a variety of vendors, and I would venture to guess that's probably the case for everyone who's listening today. Now, there's not enough time to cover all of the information in detail because it's literally pages and pages of information. However, it will be included in the report that will soon be posted on the Enterprise Management website. And the paper includes this chart that you see here, as well as detailed information describing how each vendor listed here, how their solutions address the life cycle stages that I've been talking about throughout my presentation. Now, that being said, everybody likes stories. I know I always enjoy them when I'm listening to presentations. And so the participating vendors were also offered the opportunity to provide customer case studies for the report. And I don't know how well acquainted you are with this process, but it's quite difficult very often for analysts to get access to customers because so many companies today are sensitive about being publicly identified. So I really thank all 6 of the vendors who made arrangements with their customers for me to speak with them. Sponsors of this research received full case studies. Non-sponsors received mini case studies. The next few slides are going to provide you with some highlights of each case study. Again, thanks to IBM, DB Maestro, Nolio, Serena, and Splunk, all of whom provided me with some great customers to speak with as part of this research. IBM actually supplied 2 customer interviews for full-length interviews and case studies, and the stories are so interesting, I wanted to include at least a high-level summary of each as part of this presentation. The 2 are kind of interesting because in the first company, this one which I'm going to be discussing now, DevOps practices actually built a foundation for Agile development by enabling operations to more efficiently absorb the impact of change. Now, as you'll see on the next slide, the second IBM case study, things were reversed. In that case study, Agile development was the push for DevOps practices. So it was interesting to me that, there's no one way to do this. In the case of this particular company, their product is included as a component of home entertainment system packages. When the systems are installed, customers access an online website to remotely provision and personalize their components. Despite the engineering team's best efforts to ensure that everything went well during their busy holiday season, nevertheless, once customers started opening their home entertainment systems, this company received a flood of calls from unhappy customers who couldn't provision their devices. It's the worst case scenario for any developer. In the words of the engineer I spoke to for this study, it was a bad Christmas for IT and engineering. They trace the problem to code, basically inconsistent code promotion and deployment processes. Test environments were provisioned and configured differently from production environments, and each new environment was provisioned in a totally different way. So software was deployed differently depending on which type of testing you were doing or if you were promoting to production. Errors in the environments were masked by the fact that deployment seemed to go smoothly. However, in the end, the production environment included a fatal flaw which obviously impacted customers. After diagnosing and fixing the initial problem, the company formed a dedicated cross-functional team and built repeatable processes across the software lifecycle. This not only solved the consistency problem, it also paved the way for seamless adoption of Agile development and operations practices. The outcomes of all this were pretty impressive. Releases take almost 80% less time, and the company has been able to release almost 10 times more releases than they could previously handle, and typically the releases are at far better levels of reliability. So hopefully from now on, their holiday seasons will be much more pleasant. In the second case study, as I mentioned on the prior slide, the reverse was true. This company first adopted Agile practices, and frequent releases then drove them to improve their DevOps capability. The company is part of the financial services industry, which, as you know, has been the focus of massive regulatory changes in recent years. And with their industry in constant flux, they needed a faster way to translate regulatory changes into actual software changes. They automated their processes to the point where automated tests were run at each code check-in. In addition, system tests were automatically run nightly. The result, and I haven't heard this from many companies, I can guarantee, is that many of their production rollouts are now bug-free, which, as most of you know, is quite a difficult feat. So definitely some interesting stories there. We also have some fascinating mini case studies here as well. I had the opportunity to do, again, just quick one-page case studies with DB Maestro, Nolio, Serena, and Splunk. In the case of DB Maestro, the product enabled the customer to ensure that changes one developer made to the database didn't impact another developer's modifications. So obviously in this particular case, this product was focusing on changes to the database that happen during application development. The product also enabled the customer to version database changes in the same way they version code changes. In the case of Nolio, the Nolio customer I spoke to was able to transform a basically manual process into a predictable automated process. In doing so, this customer found that their deployments were far more reliable and that collaborations across dev and ops became far more seamless than was the case without automation. The Serena customer used the product primarily for deployment as well. Again, they were able to automate manual processes so that IT personnel no longer had to spend a weekend a month at work manually provisioning software. So the automated portion of the software deployment, again, was a tremendous time saver. Finally, Splunk enabled a social media company to do continuous deployment to address rapid changes in user needs. Continuous deployment requires high levels of collaboration across business, development, and operations. It also requires real-time testing to detect any adverse impact to production as soon as possible. This customer is now doing, and this is pretty unbelievable, up to 40 incremental releases daily. And in doing so, they've been able to improve their ability to respond to current events, things that are happening out there in the news and in the social media space, and also adapting very quickly to changing customer requirements. And this is the company also that's doing A and B testing, so they very often are juggling two versions of the same website at one time and are using analytics to figure out which one is the most popular. So another very interesting story. So to summarize, we promised to keep this at a half an hour, and I think we're going to come in pretty close. The rise of DevOps actually was driven by necessity. Businesses forced to do more with less found themselves struggling with the need to introduce applications into production more frequently and more seamlessly. However, as DevOps practices matured, many companies found that it wasn't enough to enable Dev and Ops to better communicate only during the deployment stage of the life cycle. They also had to find ways to collaborate across the life cycle and to bring business into the equation at each stage. The life cycle DevOps we're seeing today is enabling quantum leaps in the quality of production software. By adopting Agile practices, including representatives of line of business across the life cycle and automating standard processes, zero-bug application deployments are finally becoming a reality at some companies. So if your company is one of the approximately 70% who have minimal interest in DevOps, it might be worthwhile to take a second look at a more lifecycle-centric and tool-centric approach. So with that, that actually concludes my presentation. I think we're nearing the end of the time frame. What do you think about questions, Raleigh? Do we have time, or should we answer them via email?
Let's go ahead and answer them via email. We are just right at the 30-minute mark, and we really wanted to be cognizant of all of your time. As I mentioned earlier, you will be receiving a follow-up email from Enterprise Management Associates tomorrow, and it will include the on-demand playback for any of you who want to listen again or missed any portion of today's event. Also, when Julie's DevOps report is available, you'll also receive an email notifying you of that. Thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.